I don't think I need to say anything else except please welcome David Zock.
God bless you, sir. All right. Thanks, Dale. Now, I've got to begin with some sort of good news and bad news. This is a work in progress. That's the, I have to turn it on? And you're thinking, he's a futurist. Wouldn't he have known that? Is it on now? It is. Excellent. Before I was so rudely interrupted, this is a work in progress, and unfortunately, you're coming into the middle of it. And this is so. I was a professional speaker. I would go all around, mostly U.S. and Europe, helping organizations how to think about the future. And as Dale said, I obviously can't predict the future, because if I could predict the future, would I be here? And the answer is yes. It's how do we think? And so the theme of the conference, to think again. Well, I'm going to take it in some slightly different angles, not so much talking that much about eugenics, because we know it's evil, and there are some good things we can talk about. The other problem is, because I caught COVID in June, and then like when dealing with some of these after effects, and thank you, many of you, like when you found out that, you sent your prayers, and that was helpful, but organizing and polishing this thing was going to be done in June and July. And so I think it's a little less polished, and that's my way of lowering your expectations. And I had an argument with Dale, and I said, I can't possibly cover this in 45 minutes to an hour. It's more like 3 hours. So we argued back and forth, and we finally came up with a compromise. I'm only going to talk for about 45 minutes, but it's going to seem like it took 3 hours. Okay. And a lot of this is on, the interplay, as we think about progress, the interplay between knowledge, skills, and faith, and how it leads us towards progress. Okay. Yes, wait. So, the fog of war, I need to explain that. First was described by Karl von Clausewitz, 1873, who said, war is the realm of uncertainty. 3/4 of the factors on which action in war is based are wrapped in a fog of greater or lesser uncertainty. A sensitive and discriminating judgment is called for, a skilled intelligence to scent out the truth. His book on war was like one of these things that all people had to study, and I think that the weapon was boredom or something like that. Sir Lonsdale Augustus Hale in 1896, I think he said rather well, the state of ignorance in which commanders frequently find themselves as regards the real strength and position, not only of their foes, but also of their friends. And I think that's in particular a problem for Christians, is because, we sort of have this idea of what this perfect thing is. And the people around us and the people even working for it are frustratingly fallen and making mistakes. And it seems to me that the doctrine of forgiveness has to be applied even more to our friends than perhaps our enemies. And there was a book by Annie Duke. So I actually read books by people other than Chesterton, and I think you should too. Annie Duke was a world champion poker player, and she wrote a book called Thinking in Bets. And she says, we are always, or this is sort of my interpretation, we are always in some kind of fog when we're making decisions. We bring to it limited knowledge, skills, and luck. We try to discern, we build up our decision-making skills, we make choices. That is, we place our bets. Sometimes there is luck, sometimes there is even grace, sometimes there is not. Now, if we think about the term the fog of progress, which just occurred to me one time when I was reading about the fog of war. It's a different kind of battle. Greg, the student, where are you? Okay, well, when he spoke at the banquet, he talked about, we were in a war. And of course, there's always the upgrading of the weapons. And now it's a war between the future and the past and trying to eliminate the past. And in terms of the weaponry, amongst the weaponry are such diverse elements as distraction, isolation, seduction, and an almost fanatical devotion to the following of science. G.K. Chesterton talked about the fatal metaphor of progress, which means leaving things behind us, and has utterly obscured the real idea of growth, which means leaving things inside of us. Those things can protect us. This is a war over staying curious and keeping attentive to important things. As Chesterton has said, we have forgotten who we are, and where we are going. We have lost our address and where our home truly is. For the most part, most people don't understand the battle. We don't understand the weapons being used. Never before have there been so many weapons of mass destruction. Never before have we been so vulnerable to distraction. This is all intentional, and it is very scientific. When you find yourself in fog, the first thing is to slow down, look around, and get a sense of your surroundings. We're quite often when we're driving, we don't want to slow down because we're in a hurry. But fog, that's the question. That's the thing that fog asks of you, to slow down, to pause. When making a decision within the fog of progress, do you also ask, who's not here? Who's not here? Because if they were here, they might help you dramatically make dramatically different choices than you first thought. It very well may be that they're not evil or stupid or just old and dead. They might also be able to see things you haven't ignored or denied. Do you seek the insights from the democracy of the dead? Because that's their target. They first want to kill off the democracy of the dead, wipe that out, because the democracy of the living cannot survive without that. Do you ask them, have we seen this before? Perhaps not in exact detail, but in the similar intent and endpoint, which of course is the end of view and the defilement of truth, beauty, goodness of the world. A fascinating thing we forget about fog is that it is cozy, it is sensual, it is mysterious, it's even romantic. When you find yourself in fog, please pause, look around, be present in that place, and be in that moment of time. Fog gives you an opportunity to get a sense of who you are, separated from all the madnesses of the fads and the trends, and be more aware and closer to God. We've not only lost our address, we've forgotten whence we came. For far too many, life was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And speaking of whence, how many of you came from more than 10 miles away? Okay. This is progress, the fact that we can do these things. The fact that we have running lights, electricity, all these things that we kind of take for granted because we forget what the world was like before we were here. And that's why we have to look back to that democracy of the dead. I do believe that progress is real. And what was called in 1935 science and mechanics is, that's design and logistics at this point. How we create things and how we move them, how we get them from point to point. And it is astounding how good we have gotten with this. but the graphic's there. So in 2015 and 2016, for some reason, I had torn retinas. My retinas tore 3 times. And to fix that, they fixed them with lasers. You've heard the phrase, better than a poke in the eye with a sharp stick? When they do the laser surgery, first they poke you in the eye with a sharp stick, and then they shoot a laser into it. But if I hadn't had that surgery, I would be blind in both eyes. And I'm saying this because we all have experiences of some way or another where medical science or any kind of science has brought us farther. Progress is real. But I think quite often we think that, well, there's a lot of the culture that think change is progress. It's not. I spent a lot of my career talking to architects and architectural students. And when talking to the architectural students, I would ask them, how many of you want to be change agents? Most of the hands went up. And then I would ask, how many of you want to be agents of tradition? And 1 or 2 hands would go up, including my own, because they think that tradition is bad, that change is good. And it would take a very simple conversation, not very deep at all, to get them to think, no, that change might not be good. But that's the surface of that. The one measure of progress is to not be struggling against the same damn problems day after day, year after year, century after century. Are we facing new problems that comes from the change? And what skills, knowledge, and faith help us to solve those problems? So if any of you are still around this week, there is a marvelous museum down in downtown Milwaukee called the Groman Museum of Work. It's all these things of work. And to say how far we've come, to give evidence of that, you see the laborer, an old man still chopping wood, and the obvious shackles from slavery, and the image up in the corner, which you can't see very well, but it was a painting of a scene from the 30 Years' War. And it showed at that museum a map of how devastated the population was in Germany, where some parts of it, over 50% of the population died. And what the painting shows, it's a young couple with an old man, and she's helping to plow the field, and she's in barefoot, and the soldiers, they would come through, they would take all the food, and they would either take or kill the livestock, so the soldiers coming after them couldn't have it, and so how much, starved. And that little video you saw, that was from 1933, a 3-year-old chimney sweep in England. And you get the sense of, wow, we have come someplace. There is progress. And how you're familiar with this photo? It's from the Cassini space probe looking back towards the sun, Saturn eclipsing the sun, and Earth is there. It gives you some perspective. And this latest photo from the Webb telescope. And most of those little specks of light are galaxies. So 1,000 galaxies. And that picture they describe essentially is at arm's length, you are holding a grain of sand. And that image is behind the grain of sand. This is a universe made for curiosity, for learning, for discovery. There are 2 trillion galaxies in the universe. More or less. I don't think it's a round number like that. But Chesterton said that God hid his mirth from us. He might have also hid his math from us. In terms of the science and design that went into all of this. And there are approximately 100 billion stars in the Milky Way galaxy. Now, I know it's our galaxy, but it's nothing special. It's just an ordinary galaxy. Now, who can quickly do the math on how many stars there are in the universe? Yes? Just one? Just one star? In the universe? No, there's a Yes, I think maybe I misstated the question. Anyway, there's a lot of stars out there. And I'm pretty sure, like, we don't understand why there are those. And you ever heard the line that either we are alone in the universe or we're not? In either case, the answer is profound. And then, of course, Woody Allen said, the surest sign that there is intelligent life elsewhere in the universe is the fact that they've never tried to contact us. All right, industrializing progress. So I actually have a degree from the University of Houston in futures research. That is a real degree from a real university. And when I was getting into that degree and studying all about it, I found out about the Chicago World's Fair in 1933 and the New York World's Fair in 1939. And this is where, from our cultural point of view, where the future began. It was the rise of industrial design. It was the rise of industrial designers. And there were sort of perceptions of the future. They were in the midst of the Depression in 33. And people were desperate for some sort of vision. But because industrial design, in terms of being able to make things and distribute things, that this was something that was changing the world. They challenged the idea that the world was not a good place, that it could be a great place, that it could be something that we create. Creating the future from their perspective was not only going to be fun, it was going to be easy. In the 1920s, Art Deco emerged as a style. It was optimistic. It was the first international style. And they used a lot of materials that we hadn't known about, or we had created new materials from engineering and science. And in the 1930s, it got streamlined. So it was slick. It was sort of as if it was airstreaming. So the design of airplanes to fly through the air, or they looked at the design of fish in terms of how they could quickly pass through water. The early Art Deco stuff was kind of anchored in the rest of the world in their designs. Streamline was very much from the United States. And it was an age of machines. They were everywhere. They took us into the sky and speeding into the future, leaving the past behind. Nothing could stop us. It was the Icarus of design styles. These are just things that I've collected over the years, but these are all streamlined design. And what you see in a lot of streamline is straights and curves. But chrome was essentially a new product. It had been invented in the 1800s, but it became a popular product and just sleek, little detail, but it was all about the future. I'm probably the only person in the room that owns a streamline image of Mary. I wish you could see this. This was, or is, the A.O. Smith's research tower that's about at 35th and I think Meineke in Milwaukee. It was built in the 1930s. Frank Lloyd Wright said it was the most significant new piece of architecture in the country, and Architectural Digest did an entire issue on just this building because of the innovation. But look at the lobby there. They made car frames, and they also made weapons. They became one of the major suppliers for bombs during World War II. But the confidence that went into have this sleek, the floors were lit up from beneath through the glass, and the tables, you can actually see one of those tables at the Milwaukee Art Museum. That it's worth a lot of money. But one of the things it also told you about the 1930s is the future wasn't just going to come from New York or Los Angeles, San Francisco, that it could come from places like Milwaukee. So there was almost this sense of democratization of how we looked at the future and where it was going to come from. And then I found a book called Eugenic Design. And it's about the streamlining of America. Streamlined design came out of the people that became industrial designers, came out of advertising and theater design. So two occupations based on fantasy. And it was, in part to escape the depression and day-to-day hardships. And it was a fantasy about the world to come. These fairs were immensely popular. Millions and millions of people went to that. And it was all about getting rid of the nasty, dirty past, and science and engineering with efficiency, speed, and cleanliness and ideal types. We would be able to create heaven on earth. And all you had to do was trust us. The seduction of what theater and advertising, it's what those people do best. I don't think we realize how seductive this was from the world that we had been emerging from. Because an awful lot of the eugenics are still here, just with different names. You have Margaret Sanger there on the cover of Time, and Adolf Hitler. And what a lot of people don't realize is, we think that this stuff came from Nazi Germany. No, the Nazis came here and learned it from our society, and in particular from the industrial designers. And it was all about, in many ways, about cleanliness, but just sort of this, we tried to take it to everything, because at the time, we were learning all about machines, and machines were going everywhere into everybody's homes. And we started looking at the human body as a machine. And so like is it Turner that did the time motion studies? Okay. But what came out of those time motion studies is they started thinking of the human body as a machine and something that could be changed, something that could be improved or replaced. Chesterton realized all of this, and he realized it long before others did. Eugenics and Other Evils was written in 1910, but not published until 1922. The intervening years did nothing to dissuade his arguments, and the 1920s and 30s only convinced him more that evil was organized and pressing us forward into that brave new world. These are two posters that would be in fairs, and so this was a very popular thing throughout the country in terms of only healthy seed must be sown, and it wasn't about farming. And they had the Better Baby contests. How many are familiar with Reinhold Niebuhr? So, Protestant theologian, and I read this. I was a political science and philosophy major at Madison, and read this, I think, in my sophomore year. And the line that I remember most was that most evil is not done by evil people. Most evil is done by good people with naive intentions that are seduced by a limited few and applied to the world. The Children of Light, the Children of Darkness. It was published in 1944. This is a map of the United States. Sorry for the lack of detail. But legislative status of eugenical sterilization in the United States and the total number of operations by each state to January 1st of 1935. And California at 9,907. Utah had repealed the law. You can tell the Wisconsin one was before we gave up the Upper Peninsula, apparently. But this was everywhere. And it was part of an optimistic view of the future. It was from science. There's another poster that was in the fairs, release the stranglehold of hereditary diseases and unfitness. And this is what the smart people believed. They were following the science as presented back then. Two great lines from Chesterton from the book. Evil always takes advantage of ambiguity. And evil always wins through the strength of its splendid dupes. And there has, in all ages, been a disastrous alliance between abnormal innocence and abnormal sin. That's also a streamlined image of Chesterton. It's all done with straight lines, which is a funny thing to do to a guy who was round. And I really don't want to talk about evil, but you kind of have to mention it. And part of it is, the things that we worry about now. I think there's an awful lot of splendid dupes alive today. And I think it's evil to unleash apps without making more obvious and intuitive guidelines and guardrails that might prevent the devouring of time and attention that was meant for others, as our lives are converted into pixels. The portrait of Dorian Gray has become real, no longer hidden in the attics, but hiding in plain sight on our devices. It's evil to create drones and weaponized mechanical dogs, weaponized to downsource war to the highest and, of course, the lowest bidder. It's evil to create artificial intelligence and not care about the unintended consequences and the hidden consequences. Again, evil quite often happens because we don't care about the immediate implication, or the other than the immediate implications of the questions. One of the things they say as a futurist, you want to be a futurist, then think about the implications of a decision times 3. We're really good at going, if this, then that. But where we fall down is, and then what happens? What are the implications of the implications of the implications? Not that you have to predict the future exactly, but are you at least exploring the possibilities and then quite often doing that with the minds of others so that you're not just within that little tiny view that you have of from yourself. It's evil to suggest that everything is a choice, and then to say you really don't have a choice about it. Great civilizations are seldom destroyed from without. They're destroyed by those from within who desire a release from the atomized freedom that eventually feels like slavery because they found that the God of the self was more demanding and completely unforgiving. They step beyond the edge, away from forgiveness and grace, because all they can do now is stare into the abyss, and the abyss really does stare back. As the writer David Goldman has said of such civilizations as ours, that lose a compelling and insistent sense of hope for the future, it's not like it's going to be the end of the world. It's just going to be the end of you. Through a fog, curiously. I sort of stole that line. So the story of progress so far. We're in a situation, we want to change it, but yet our humility doesn't quite keep up with our abilities. We're trying to get home and we're trying to use our toys and our tools to get there sooner, to get away from here, bypass the whole thing and try to create heaven here on earth without the middlemen. With hubris comes nemesis, always. And it is some measure of progress to know that. Because we can imagine what a God is, we want that too. We often hate our limitations. We don't want to outsource God anymore. So we attempt to soar beyond the limits and we fall down. As Chesterton said, pride is the fall. It certainly was for Icarus. This is a constant about us. We forget our place, which is not so much on the ground, but as children of God with some measure and some memory of humility. And that humility is good. It is the end point of progress, to be liberated from our illnesses and our weaknesses, or is it to finally be freed from our humanity, which an awful lot of people find very annoying. Speaking of the story so far, this is what the world had before Christianity. A cacophony of gods that left us to the whim of unpredictable forces. People had no reason to trust a world run by capricious, adulterous, treacherous, murderous, incestuous, mendacious, ravenous, rapacious, and generally unreliable bunch of jerks. I mean, gods. And then when we got rid of them, all we got was just one god. Well, okay, 3 in 1, but still, there's like some math going on there. I mentioned David Goldman before, and he wrote this book, How Civilizations Die, David Goldman. And he talks in there about the covenant between God and the Jews, and eventually the Christians, and that the one God was a loving God and gave to us as a gift a discernible world. Consistency, recognizable principles, such as cause and effect. It made the world predictable. And a predictable world is the foundation of freedom. If I can make reliable predictions of how the world works and the behavior of those within it, then I can plan. I can turn my back and get to work. I can build. I can create progress. Such a world can only come from a loving God. This is not to say the world, and especially the people in it, are completely predictable. So we craft laws, morals, and customs to increase the predictability and the trust. Let's talk about pirates. It's time we talked about pirates. We have this sense from watching the media that pirates are like Johnny Depp, either a playful scallywag or ho ho ho, yo ho ho. I mean, not the other ho 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 guy. I get them mixed up in my brain. You can tell that's my brain there. So the word pirate comes from a Greek term meaning to put to the test. And pirates, corsairs, were the outlaws. Pirates, quite often, were inside the law. They were hired by the governments. And what they would do is they would try to figure out what is the law. Laws are not meant to be broken, but they are meant to be tested. Is this still valid? Have circumstances changed where we might have to, in a living dynamic society, have to make some changes? And we're asking, how does the world really work? It's often done by challenging the dominant zeitgeist, the dominant ideas and beliefs of the time. Pope Benedict XVI, he said that doubt is the handmaiden of faith. I think curiosity is also a handmaiden of faith. And I think doubt and curiosity are inseparably important to each other and to all of us. And then the story of Pandora. So she was the girl with all the gifts. She was given this, not a box, a jar. I didn't have boxes back then. A jar, and with only one requirement: never, ever open it. If you are given a jar, or in modern days, a box, and you can do anything you want with it except not open it, how many of you would never open it? Liar. No, this is part of our nature, is to push beyond the boundaries and to check to see what is the law. Is that still valid? And we are built for curiosity. G.K. Chesterton had a wonderful defense of curiosity. He said, if Christianity should happen to be true, that is to say, if its God is the real God of the universe, then defending it may mean talking about anything and everything. Things can be irrelevant to the proposition that Christianity is false, but nothing can be irrelevant to the proposition that Christianity is true. That, to me, is an invitation from God to learn and keep learning and to be curious. Curiosity opens the world to adventure. It's an open invitation to mystery. God, through the gift of curiosity, wants us to solve mysteries. Father Brown mysteries, for example. And I think the point there is no matter how predictable the world is, no matter how predictable we are to each other, we in the world will fall short. We are limited creatures. We are fallen creatures. Mistakes will be made. Surprises will come from the most unexpected places, and so will the solutions. In such a world, forgiveness will be necessary and abundant. So is salvation. And then along came a spider. Arachne. Do you know who Arachne was? She was an Athenian maiden who was rather good at weaving things. And in her hubris, she challenged Athena, the goddess of crafts, to a weaving contest. And when Athena examined her textile, could find no errors, so being one of those capricious gods, she beat up Arachne with her spindle. And Arachne, in her shame, hung herself. So then there were gods that took pity on her, because that's what they would often do after they did something. They changed her into a spider. So what do spiders and weaving have to do with curiosities, you ask? Or at least I'm asking. This is your brain on curiosity. How many of you have been told at any point in your life, including perhaps even this morning, that your head was full of cobwebs? You know, that we got these accusations, and I certainly did. It's a fine compliment. The brain has basically two advanced functions that you have control over. One is to ask questions, and the other one is to connect the answers. Ian Leslie wrote a book called Curious. In there, he said between the ages of 2 and 5, children asked 40,000 explanatory questions. That's 36.5 questions per day. Susan, does that number seem low to you? Susan Engel wrote a book called The Intellectual Life of Children. And she said studies suggest that children can ask up to 90 questions a day. Apple TV has a great program called Becoming You. And it's about the first 2,000 days of childhood brain development. And in one episode, there's this mom with two little moppets walking along. I think they're like 3 or 4 or something like that. They're walking along in Manhattan, and there's a bird. And one of the kids says, "Why is that bird there?" And the mom says, "Well, because her nest is there." "Why is her nest there?" You know, and just going on and on. And what they found was that these kids hit gusts of 90 questions an hour. Lots of things to learn. So this is diversive curiosity, where you ask a question and the answer sticks in your brain. It gets caught on the web, and the web is linked. But diversive curiosity is you're trying to figure out how does the world work? What's going on here? You're just trying to grasp the whole thing, because every baby comes in with no instructions in that regard. So they ask questions. Lots and lots of questions. Epistemic curiosity is where you start to connect the ideas. That patterns emerge the more you ask questions. Your curiosity goes down rabbit holes. So for those of you that have chosen some particular thing to be interested in or curious about, that you've gained competence with, this is what it's all about. And, for instance, these are two fields that I've done a lot of speaking to: architecture and medicine. Patterns emerge. But one of the problems with epistemic curiosity is that you start to lose your diversive curiosity. Because we all know people who are too curious as adults, and they're kind of annoying. And so one of the things you have to do is you kind of have to curate your curiosity self-direct, study on your own, but there's always this one person that keeps on asking questions. But when we lose diversive curiosity, in a dynamically changing world, it puts us in danger of not knowing how that world works. Zena Hitz, who wrote a delightful book called Lost in Thought about the intellectual life, she said the purpose of curiosity is to find what has yet to be connected. So, sitting on my balcony, and I was like doing this map, and this was all the words that I started like noticing. So like I was looking at the clothing, okay, that was knit together. I was drawing something, there were ants, dancing, algae, prairies, what have you. So there's just all these things. But do they connect to anything? So with improv training, and Maria, have you done the yes and? Yes, that's who I trained with. And with yes and, something is thrown at you. And you have to say yes, and then immediately toss it something else. You connect it. And it's just this really great way of training the brain to make quick connections, to be thinking deeper outside of your comfort zone. So like 2x4s. So done a lot of work with architects. What is the one thing that most people don't know about 2x4s? They're not 2x4. So I moderated a panel for a group with architects, and one of the people on the program was Billy Fairclough. She's an architect out of Philly, and she has a YouTube TED Talk video on what we don't know about the 2x4. Starts with that, but then she gets into the molecular structure of wood, where it becomes, as she points out, when you start getting down to the atomic level and being able to organize and manipulate that, it becomes an emerging material. And you get to rethink that. And spiders, they found out that, what's the one thing about spider? What do we know about a strand of spider web? Stronger than steel. Yeah. So could that be the model of how we build buildings in the future? Following the path of nature. My little brother is a nanotechnologist who in graduate school, his work made the cover of Science magazine. Yes, he's probably adopted. But he was a 4-time college dropout who then went to Italy, studied jewelry making, came back, had a store, got married, went through a horrible divorce, sold everything, went back to college, graduated first in the class, went to UC Irvine, went to UC Berkeley, and now he's at Oak Ridge National Labs. But he said, I couldn't be a good scientist if I hadn't been an artist first. And the point is that he's one of these people that connects these diverse things to come up with something that we hadn't thought about before. So do we have to, if we like with 2x4s, with the molecular structure of wood, could we grow bones? Can we grow buildings? Where are the boundaries of the fields? And this is something that we kind of have to be curious about. Is if we think that an occupation is a singular defined thing, as Susan was saying, that there's not a set instruction just for everyone, but you figure it out and you connect things through your experiences, your connections, what have you. I did a survey when working with architectural students, and this was 2012, and the market was not real good for them. And so I surveyed them and asked, if you don't become an architect, what else might you do? Took the answers, put it into Wordle.net, and it creates word clouds. So the more that word shows up, the bigger the word is in the word cloud. Anything jump out at you? Yeah, it's like they understand that the boundaries of an occupation are artificial. They may be necessary. It's like when Chesterton talked about, if you're going to tear down a fence, first tell me why you put it there. Why was it put there? That reason doesn't exist anymore. then you have opportunities to do something else. But this only comes through curiosity, and the challenge here is, how do we choose between change and continuity? And having sort of the guidelines of faith certainly can help with that. All right, some names. Max Levchin, Peter Thiel, Luke Nosek, Ken Howery, Upan, Russell Simmons. What do those 6 names have in common? True. Good answer. Any other answers? Entrepreneurs getting warmer. They basically created PayPal. Now, here's a better question. What did 4 of the 6 do during high school? And don't say dropped out. No, they made bombs. And I'll bet there's a lot of guys in here going, yeah, I did that in high school. Because I know I did. Not big ones. They made bombs and now they're billionaires. What do we do with our delinquents? In our schools? In our church? You know, what does modernity do with its delinquents? And in great extent, they medicate them. If I were a child today in a public school, I would lose all the fun and creativity that I had growing up with marvelous parents who supported the weirdness in a good way. But, you know, so the notion of here, hold my beer and watch this is, you know, that's sometimes how innovation happens. And yes, a lot of those people die horrible deaths, but some of them go on to change the world for the better. In Ruins, Christopher Woodward. And just a neat little point about this book where he explores the world of ruins and he talks about the Colosseum. And that before the archaeologists got a hold of it, it had everything from microclimates, it had little environments, like there were plants in the Colosseum that existed nowhere else in Europe, that they think that they had been on the fur of animals brought into the Colosseum. There were hermits that lived there, there were pilgrimages that went there, and then the archaeologists got a hold of it, cleaned it up. Lovers used to go there, poets used to go there. Now they don't. And, you know, the notion of memento mori and the notion of remembering you are mortal and that something greater than you has fallen and could fall again. Why? You know, Chesterton had this thing about, you know, the mystery of, you know, the really exciting mysteries are not why, you know, how did this man die, but why is this man alive? Okay, finding our way home. There's a great line from Walker Percy from an unpublished novel. One character asks, how long have you been homesick? And the response was, all my life. You know, there were simpler times. We don't have simple times today. We still have to figure out how do we get home. So I talked about Annie Duke's, she says in every decision, there's knowledge, skill, and luck. And with knowledge, that's diversive curiosity. How does the world work? With skills, it's epistemic curiosity. Focus on competence. And then luck. And, you know, what harms luck or helps luck, and what is luck? I played around with this a little bit. I'm not sure about the theology of it, but it kind of was fun to do. So if you replace luck with faith, not giving up on luck because luck is really kind of fun too, but mystical curiosity and a focus on prayer, and maybe there's some other word that goes there. But I still think that the thing that this organization does not do enough of is apologetics. And teaching people how to be a part of, when the guy that wrote the Benedict option came and spoke to us a couple years ago, I don't like the idea of retreat. And when Gregory was talking about, this is the war, I mean, it is, and we have to be engaged in the battle. And there has to be some ideas and some structure that go with that. If we're going to be thinking, it means writing on paper. It means like having a nice notebook. I learned this from the architects and the designers that I've worked with so much, is they have notebooks, and they're usually nice notebooks with nice paper, and they have a nice pen. And this one is not an expensive pen, but it's my favorite pen. Because when you're writing, taking notes, it's the act, your brain is not isolated just in your head. Johannes Palasma is a Finnish architect who wrote The Thinking Hand. And the brain studies show the brain is a lot more distributed. So your hand knows things. But when you write as opposed to type, they've done these amazing studies of students who are, taking notes in college. And they'll divide the class, and half take notes on the computer and the other half do handwritten notes. Who has the most notes? The people typing. Who has the greatest long-term comprehension? The handwritten, yeah. Because they have to filter. They are processing. They're not stenographers. And like, I do have a Kindle. I read novels on it because to me, a novel is kind of like taking a shower. I enjoy it, but I literally cannot tell you the name of the novel I'm reading right now, which is kind of good because it's to let my brain flow into play. But if it's a book I want to learn from, and last night Chris Check had said, like that people say, oh, you shouldn't write in books. No, you should. You should buy paper books and you should write with them up because a book is not finished. You have not finished a book until you have engaged the author in a conversation. And Tim Parks, who was writing for the New York Review of Books, he said, there is something predatory, cruel even, about a pen suspended over a text. Like a hawk over a field, it is on the lookout for something vulnerable. The mere fact of holding the hand poised for action changes our attitude to the text. We are no longer passive consumers of monologue, but active participants in a dialogue. Bring the slide back up so I can... Oh, and then there's a marvelous book by Matthew Crawford called Shop Class as Soulcraft. And he's written a couple books. He's brilliant. And when I'm reading him, I keep thinking, I think this guy is Catholic, or at least has Catholic sensibilities. But it's like he notes that shop class went away in the 80s and 90s because of liability issue and because everybody's going to be a knowledge worker. He has a PhD, ran a think tank, and then quit that to open up a motorcycle repair shop. And he said that the average mechanic does far more critical thinking than the average desk jockey does. News versus olds. We are told we have to take in more news. We always have to know what the news is. Do we take in olds? News is what's new since yesterday. Might need to know in order to navigate. Olds is the stuff that hasn't changed since yesterday. You might need to know to navigate, and I am preaching to the choir here, I get it. But which is there more of, news or olds? No, news. The exponential amount of information that's growing out there, and almost it's like being squeezed out, but that's why we have organizations like this where we have to learn to protect. And then the last one here is, for years I've talked about the difference between fads, trends, and principles, but then while I was playing with the curiosity and looking at the whole Catholic thing, I thought, well, it's sort of a triune sense of curiosity. You go from the momentary to the eternal. And quite often, the momentary gets pulled into the market, it becomes a consumer thing in fads. But Susan, I don't think I will ever look at a momentary thing again when you talked about the delight of dirty diapers. But what was delightful about your presentation is that you took joy in all of it, and that we are so often seduced by the trends and those momentary fads, the consumer society that is taking us and consuming our attention. Moments are marvelous. So sort of think about like a state of prayer, play, love, even work. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. I won't spell that for you because it is not. You cannot spell this name. It's like 20 letters long. But he wrote a book called Flow. And it's about being in that state of flow where time goes away. And that's the cool thing about moments. I would also recommend a book called Drunk by Edward Stringerland, how we sipped, stumbled, and danced our way into civilization. It's about the value of letting loose once in a while. He is very clear about the dangers of alcohol, but he is also very clear about the delight of letting down your guard and being more open and more conversant and more playful, because we get so caught up, again, in the trends where that's what we have to work for. Well, touched the wrong button there. So I think, like the trends of the temporal thing. That's where that's where we compete and where we have to build or try to prevent something from being torn down. And Chesterton said the conservative has exactly the same error as the progressive. It consists of the fact that each of them allows the truth to be determined by time. That is, he says, he judges a thing by whether it is of yesterday or today or tomorrow, not by what is in eternity. And I think that the eternal is the thing that we can't quite comprehend. And just like Christ wouldn't show us his mirth, I don't think we have a comprehension of the eternal. But we get glimpses of it, particularly in those moments that are sort of in the cradle of the eternal, that remind us of that there is something so much more, that we are more than just this moment in time, that we are connected to that eternal. And, I think that to a certain extent Christianity is a joke, but a delightful one, and I can't wait to hear the punchline. God knows this, and as a loving God, he knows how to hide it for now, because we could not withstand the impact. But our curiosity does get the best of us in all sorts of ways. We try to grasp the eternal, but never can. I rather like the idea of a heaven that I can't imagine. I also love that it's a mystery with billions of hints available for our curiosity and our humility, patiently waiting for our wits to grow sharper. It is incomprehensibly desirable and enchanting. After all has been said in many ways, a man should exceed his grasp, because that is what heaven's for. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, David. Do we have any questions for David? I'm not as fit as Dale, so I'll take a little longer.
Thanks. I'm wondering how your concept of curiosity tracks with that of saints like Augustine and Aquinas, who would regard it as a vice, as far as, well, in different ways, knowing what's above your station, knowing things perhaps not for the end of salvation, that sort of thing. Is what you mean more like wonder?
Yes, it is very much like wonder. And I was reading about that, and I've not read very deeply into either of them, but that was describing more of sort of idle curiosity about people, gossip. But I will strongly defend that sense of wonder. In the the button, the world will never, or the button that I made, last year, the Chesterton line about the world never lack for wonders, only for a lack of wonder. And how do we keep that alive? Okay.
Yeah, a couple things. One is I'm glad you pointed out that the medication, because that Ritalin just was quite the thing in the 90s. One of the other things when you're talking the second part of your talk about the evils done was really by the good, the people, and that just so came up with this COVID stuff. In fact, I've been surprised here of how many speakers have actually used the word, I don't even like to say it, but pandemic, which it never was. We had our priest at Holy Rosary in Portland. Right when it started, he called it the COVID pandemonium, or I call it the COVID craziness. But just by using that word pandemic, says, we have to be scared, we have to take drastic measures. And then another thing from that middle part of your talk is with the eugenics is that, unfortunately in Oregon, they actually did forced sterilization up until the 1980s.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the governors apologizing for it was actually one at almost around the same time was saying how great the eugenics was going to be about killing someone when they're sick. And unfortunately, Oregon was the first government body in the whole world that legalized, killing someone. Yeah.
So there was a line, it was on one of my slides, but I didn't actually cite it. Stuart Brand, who had written like the Whole Earth Review, he's kind of a journalist, author. He said, we are becoming like gods, so we better get good at it. Then, of course, the question is, how's that been working for you so far? And there is that with hubris comes nemesis, always. And, that we will fall if we think we are gods. Because it's the one real clear thing, we are not.
I have more of a comment. I just really enjoyed all the different topics that you pieced together. My brain is still kind of like that spider web. It's a little out there. I just wanted to appeal to you as an architect and say, and also being Chestertonians, we believe in the traditions, and as an architect with the traditions, I'm just wondering if we're not really, what we think is the future really might not be the future, so to speak. It's almost like the past in a way. And then if we look back, we can, I'll give you a concrete example, and I don't want to I'm not doing a dissertation.
Was that a joke? Was that a pun? A concrete example?
Yeah, was it? Oh, okay. Wow. Didn't know it was funny. Anyway.
It was good.
Just to throw out there, because I want to tie in the expositions, the Columbian Exposition after Columbus.
That was
1893 in Chicago is an example to me of the past that looks more like the future. They had illumination without electricity, and they had movable sidewalks, and it was more advanced even than the 1933 exposition. So I guess as an architect and Chestertonian, just to challenge all of us to look to the past for progress, and it is the future instead of the future.
And there was a line in here that I skipped over about the fatal metaphor of progress. You said that we think it's about leaving things behind us when in fact it's about leaving things inside of us, and that sometimes the most progressive you can be is to not change. Here I stand, I can do no other, as it were, because you know that it's true, and the ability to defend that. Now, I would love to have conversations with you because I got so involved with architects and have become so disillusioned by so much of what I see that is being positioned as futuristic, and it's just another convoluted, these boxes upon boxes. Okay, I'm not an architect. Somehow I started speaking at architectural conventions and ended up on the national board. And my job was to go, what were you thinking?
So we have an online question. How does someone become a futurist?
Well, in the back of those comic books, can you draw Binky? It's kind of that thing. So in high school, I'm from Monroe, Wisconsin, about 100 miles away from here. And I had a course in high school called The Future. And then I went to college because I wanted to become a lawyer. I did a really smart thing in my junior year of college. I got a job in the law library, and I found out what lawyers do for a living. No offense to lawyers, I would have been a terrible lawyer. But then there was another class on the future, took that, and then I found that there was this program at the University of Houston on studies of the future, futures research, whatever you want to call it. And it wasn't about, there was some predictive methodologies they talked about, but because my background was more philosophy, where I took it was, how do we think about it? Like, what is the difference between a fad, a trend, and a principle? Because if all you're talking about is change, you're missing, so much of that. And I don't think so. That notion of I wouldn't become a member of a club that would have me as a member. There is a World Future Society, and I went to a couple of them, their conferences. And the last one I went to, I walked out of every single session because it was more like, we can change the future. We can make it perfect. No, you can't. We can try to make it better. But what are you going to base it upon?
And we have one last question.
Try to make it a good one. Yes, no pressure. Something that I've been dealing with lately is how do you get into the claims that are made by the mainstream media, higher level academics, academia, that becomes what's called now a narrative. And I saw you had fads and trends. Where do narratives, because if you object to that narrative, you're going to be canceled, you're going to be non-woke, and dire things can happen to you. What is the narrative?
Well, and this is sort of where I have to break the fourth wall and, and sort of like not be a performer up here, but as just another, participant in all of this, is I don't have a real good sense of that. And I think that, I hate to admit it, but if there's one thing I am, it is a coward. And I have spoken at over I've keynoted over 100 design conferences around the world. I can't imagine that they would hire me now because the world has changed so much and that they are not open. They're open-minded about everything they agree with. And so that's, my sense of the need for apologetics. I wish I was better able to defend the things that I believe. And, this is only the third time I've ever spoken about faith. Because it was always just something private. And it was funny, Emily was in one of my audiences years ago where, it was, you just put your first son into the academy.
Yeah.
And she came up afterward and she goes, what do you know about this Chesterton person? We just found out about this academy. And then later she said to Dale and Laura, he was preaching Christianity and they didn't know it. I didn't know it. And maybe that's kind of what we do is we take, when necessary, take the principles and just sort of put them behind the scenes, but it backs us up. So that, I will not do something contradictory to my faith, but it's more about being present and standing up for those things. But I think that we really do need, in terms of facing down that narrative, is we do need greater training in apologetics to, take it, so like in the 50s, Catholic literature and Catholic writers were very prominent. And they're not as much anymore, but you do have like journals like First Things, which, is very well respected, but I'm not sure how far it gets in the academic world today.
Join me in thanking Dave for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.